Alright, so this video here is to give you some information here about Mary Shelley and some background information on the novel Frankenstein. Um, I think Mary Shelley's biography is pretty well fascinating. A lot of this information I pulled from a biography called Mary Shelley's Monsters. It was fan-frickin-tastic. Highly recommend you read it if you are into Miss Shelley by the time you're done with the novel. So she was born in 1797. Her parents were William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was named for her mother. She was Mary Wollstonecraft herself. Her parents were actually like fairly radical and anti-marriage, like really, really early, like anti-establishment feminist thinkers here. But they did actually marry 5 months before Mary was born so that she would be legitimate, because in the legal sense of the law, children born out of wedlock were considered bastards and did not have the same rights and privileges as other children. The household that she grew up in was a household of the Enlightenment age, like these thinkers who celebrated the arts, poetry, and new philosophy and exploration and thinking in science and technology. But the people that were in her house were actually part of the first wave of the Romantic movement. And if you remember in the video, like these people didn't call themselves, the Romantics or anything. Theory and people who study literature and philosophical movements name these things after the fact. And so this is just these group of people who shared these same ideas. And these early Romantic writers, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, and Charles Lamb, hung out in her family's house. And this greatly influenced her thinking and her education. And for a woman of this time period, she was very well educated. She studied Latin and she studied the sciences. And her father raised her because her mother died 11 days after she was born. And Mary Wollstonecraft was pretty awesome. Her most famous work is entitled A Vindication of the Rights of Women, if that doesn't tell you anything. But Mary was deeply haunted by her mother's death, and she studied her mother's works. She felt responsible in some ways for her mother dying, and she was known to visit her mother's grave and hang out at her mother's grave as a way of bonding with her. When she was 17, she eloped with Percy Shelley, who also hung out at her father's house with all these other Romantic thinkers. Percy Shelley was married to a woman named Harriet, who later committed suicide. And we'll talk a little bit about these people around Mary Shelley who commit suicide. So when Mary eloped, her stepsister, Claire Claremont, actually tagged along on this trip, this elopement travel that they all did. They, with Harriet dead, they married in 1816. Mary did admit that Frankenstein was deeply encouraged and developed by Percy. We could probably spend a whole 15-minute lecture and then some just on Percy's influence in editing and helping to write Frankenstein. But Mary was deeply influenced by her husband Percy, and she was known to say that all of her literary aspirations depended on him. But to be fair, he was a cheerleader of hers. He did encourage her to write. Some critics say that's a good thing. Some people said that he molded her too much and had too much of an influence on her, that it wasn't necessarily always her voice. A little bit more scandal here. She actually became pregnant with Percy's child before their actual wedding. That child died prematurely. She eventually endured 4 births, all told, with only one child living, and that child was Percy Florence Shelley. And then even more tragically, in 1822, so not long, they hadn't been married very long, he died in a boating accident. He drowned. And she ended up just spending the rest of her life raising her child and working as an author and a writer and making a living as an author and a writer. But there's even more scandal. So Claire Claremont was actually, again, she was on that kind of elopement journey with her sister, or stepsister. And she got pregnant with Lord Byron's illegitimate child, which was born in 1817. Byron himself Eventually died in 1824 after contracting an illness in the Turkish War. But Claire, some critics say, may have been sexually involved with Percy too, that this whole group of writers that was traveling and hanging out together was all sexually involved. But there's really no hard evidence for this. Another suicide in her life is that her half-sister Fanny Imlay, who was a half-sister from her mother's side, committed suicide in 1817 at the age of 22 from a laudanum overdose. So she's just kind of plagued in her young life by these tragic deaths, with Percy's first wife killing himself, her half-sister killing himself. She's haunted by the fact that her mother has died. She's had her own children die by either miscarriage or dying prematurely. And you can't, I mean, you just can't say that these things don't impact the woman. And she had all this going on as she is writing and rewriting and editing one of the most famous works in English literature. But just for the record, so that you know, she did live herself a pretty good long life. She died at the age of 53. It is likely from a brain tumor. So let's go over to Frankenstein, though, in the dark and stormy night that brought us Frankenstein. It was a dark and stormy night. She was 19 years old in 1816. They were in Geneva, Switzerland. Again, this big old elopement party that had Mary, Percy, Claire Clairmont, Lord Byron, who knocked up Claire, okay, and then this doctor named Polidori. So they kind of made a bet amongst themselves to who's going to write the best scary story after they were reading ghost stories out loud for entertainment. Out of all the people there, she was the only one to follow through. And if you go back and look at one of the introductions in our version of the text, she actually goes into detail about this. The book was initially published anonymously in 1818. A lot of books by female writers in the Romantic era were published anonymously. Like sometimes they would just simply say, written by a woman, written by a lady, or something like that. Even Jane Austen, who was one of the late Romantics, her first works were published in this way. Critics believe that this novel really straddles the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, like these two different schools of thinking. That Victor Frankenstein represents the Enlightenment and not in a positive way, whereas The Creature represents the Romantic viewpoint of celebrating the individual and the innocence of a child and the connection with nature and all that stuff. So it's also good to think about historic context and to not completely disregard this. You should know the time period is ambiguous. It purposefully says 17 dash dash because they don't want this tied to a specific time period, and no historical events are directly referenced within the text. But you can definitely see how it is set at the end of the Enlightenment age and the start of the Romantic movement. Again, take into consideration that these people didn't call themselves the Enlightened or the Romantics or anything like that. It's just what we can tell in terms of literary and philosophical trends of the time period. The French Revolution took place between 1789 and 1799, and as you know, the Romantics were pro-rebellion because of it allowed individual freedom, and social hierarchy stifled individual freedom, but take into account that a lot of the Romantic thinkers were horrified by the bloody nature of the French Revolution. This is also the time of the Industrial Revolution that we see a shift from an agrarian farming society into an industrial society, and because of that industrial society, there were very large, impoverished, restless working class people. There was urban sprawl, overcrowding, growing populace, things like this, and an anxious middle class that was growing, that was economically insecure. These are things that the Romantics kind of rejected in a way, because again, that these types of situations would oppress the individual. And a lot of Romantics also sympathized with the poor, that the poor were being deprived in many ways. This novel does contain some stereotyping of non-European races, like the way that we would look at it as being racist. So take that into account when you see some of those references. And I have mentioned this before, that this is epistolary in framework, that it is like a series of letters. It opens up with Walton writing those letters to his sister, and then he decides to then say that he's going to change and write as if Frankenstein is writing, so he can truly capture his voice. In terms of the sources of the novel, these come from Mary Shelley herself, that she had overheard Lord Byron and Percy discuss the nature of life and the ability to reanimate a body. There were a lot of 19th century advancements in chemistry at the time and new discovery of elements and experiments. There were also noted electrical experiments that were done on criminals. The novel never explicitly says how the creature is made, but we can infer that electricity was somehow part of it, and you'll understand why. But a specific example of this was a magazine printing a detailed description of an executed murderer, who's basically like his corpse was shocked, like they purposefully like sent a jolt through it, and it reported the reactions of the body and how it seemed like the body was coming back to life. Also, during this time, grave robbing was very commonly done. These men were called resurrectionists or resurrection men, and the reason why grave robbing was so commonly done is really because of doctors. That medical schools could only do autopsies on executed criminals, and that kind of like shrinks the pool of available bodies, and it also shrinks what you're able to learn if you can't get a particular age or gender or something like that. This actually caused people to like purchase special coffins called mort safes to protect your body. Like, this was a genuine concern of people at the time. But in 1832, there was something called the Anatomy Act that allowed fewer restrictions on doing autopsies in order to stop grave robbing, because it was that much of a problem. And grave robbing is referenced to in this book. So I hope that helps you to understand a little bit about Mary Shelley and what is going on in her life and some of the things that were going on during the time period. Like I said, Mary Shelley is pretty cool. I don't know about you, but I was a hot mess at 19, and it looked like she accomplished something pretty impressive at that time.